Hello world. Today I'm going to start another new series, Blender Basics. Something for people who started learning Blender like yesterday. Because for them there are not that many tutorials. Because every other guy who's doing stuff in Blender on internet, they assume that very basic stuff they people have to know by default. Today it's not going to be navigation or something primitive like that. Today I'm going to start with UV unwrapping, UV map unwrapping. So this is standard cube in Blender, and by default it's already unwrapped. Actually, probably we have to add some shader on it to make texture visible. I have some tiled testing texture prepared. Let me just load it here. So this is very standard tiling texture. It's actually small. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger by adding mapping and texture coordinate. Okay, and let's scale it, for example, 5 times. So, and this is how it looks like on UV editor. I hope you can see it, because let's temporarily turn off the texture, disconnect texture. Oh, it didn't help. Come on. That's how this cube unwrapped. So basically what happened, I'll duplicate this one cube and hide it temporarily, and I'll try to explain on the 3D what happened here. By default it's unwrapped. Basically, just let me cut the edges. I think I cut them correctly. It's split, and just so you understand, it's like a card box unwrapped, like give me a second, like this. So like this. So when you have different shapes on Blender, let's delete this one and hide all. This is how it's unwrapped by default. In a Blender there is a the feature, how to say it, I'm sorry, I might pronounce it incorrectly. I do pronounce it incorrectly, I think. The edge mark seam. So if you mark seam on the selected edges, it's turned to a different color. Don't pay attention on my menu, not menu. My settings are different because I change them by myself. Personally, I just prefer works with different colors. For example, on original Blender, the selected edges and selected faces, they are orange, I think, and the edge seam on original is red. If you mark seam on default settings on Blender, it's turned into a red. That means that seam is marked. But I recolor it to a green to differentiate it from selected edges. So right now I'm going to show you like recreate the unwrapping, default unwrapping on a cube. Okay, we marked all the seam, and if we click the press U button on a keyboard and unwrap it, well, it unwrap basically similarly. Okay, let's just for experiment, and let's see the results. For experiment, just clear the marked seam on these two edges, and after you try to unwrap it, it's gonna do it weird way. Look, it's understand it like a how to explain that correctly, like these areas, they are kind of like stitched as a piece of cloth, something similar, and on actual geometry it's gonna have all these weird stretches, and it won't look good. So when you unwrapping, for example, more complex geometry, just I'm going to model something very quickly. Just give me a second. Some a little bit more complicated object. If you have, for example, some piece of geometry which look okay, and for example this piece of geometry, and you have to unwrap it for texturing. Add some same material to it, and look, because it was edited from a regular box, all the edges, all the geometry we added, because it's not unwrapped, it's look messy. It's not, so let's try re-unwrap it correctly. Because unwrapping really depends on the shape of the geometry. So, for example, we can mark this seam, okay, we marked this seam, not yet, no, we marked this seam, and now I'll try to show you. these faces, this is going to unwrap correctly, and this area, which now white, is not going to unwrap correctly. Even here there can be some issues. Let's select all, press U, unwrapped, and see results. We can select by segment and areas where there is no seam, there is no cutted geometry. They are kind of try to unwrap texture spherically, like a sphere, and that's why it has all this weird stretching. If we try to mark seams in the way to avoid this spherical unwrapping, you really have to just have some experience with it. It's just play with it and experiment, get through experimental phase. Only later you will be able to understand how to unwrap geometry correctly. For example, this piece, in order to avoid weird stretching, it's the mark seam here, and this seam has to be cleared. Okay, now if we try to unwrap it, it should give us correct results. Yeah, the only thing which is not desirable is this turned elements, but you can always fix it manually. If your texture is repeated, you can leave them overlay of each other, like but sometimes you need to reposition them in order to properly texture them later. This is very basic texturing, and with this test texture you can see which areas has to be rotated correct way. For example, this part, because this number 7 is rotated incorrectly. In order to look correct, it has to be like this. All other areas relatively okay. Maybe this one, because it's upside down. Let's rotate it here. We move it a little bit. Yeah. Now this is properly unwrapped geometry. This one is bothering me because it's how to say it, it's take too much area at the texture, and it's difficult to place it. If you place it here, it's going out of the square, and it's no good. So you can always unwrap. You can see which area it is taking on geometry by moving it. And just maybe we can separate it here just by marking seam, selecting all faces, pressing U, unwrap, and it's automatically rearranged most most optimized way the Blender think like itself by itself. But when we turn on the texturing in a viewport mode, yeah, it's most of course it's a most optimized placing here, but again it's turned some of the elements upside down again, this piece, and so a lot of things you still have to do manually. But for automatization of the unwrapping, I think it's good. Well, and especially if your texture, for example, some kind of noise or repeated texture like some dirt, uniform dirt, it can be even like scaled or easily overlay each other. Fortunately I don't have a texture to test it right now, but actually I do. I can in a different folder, just give me a second. Somewhere here I think. Here is this leather texture, and it has a repeated pattern, and it can easily be scaled. Now, if it's scaled, you can see repeated pattern. If you scale it back to the square, oh, it's repeated also because the shader is scaled 5 times. If we get it back to 1 1 1, so but now it's much bigger. You scale it right here, and interactively you can see the scale on a geometry. So I hope this tutorial, this video helps someone who just starting out doing things in Blender. I have to admit though, I'm not really good at texturing because I didn't spend much time on it, and I prefer to keep all my materials and shaders as simple as it possible. So yeah, that's why I'm not really professional in this area. But it's a tutorial just for very beginners who just starting, like maybe very recently. It's very basic. Unwrapping. There are different types of unwrapping. Also, I gotta tell you, there is a unwrapping cube projection, for example. It's just unwrap geometry based on a cube projection from each side. It's create like from top side all the faces which are facing to like this is gonna be unwrapped this way. From a side it's going to be unwrapped from a side 90 degree, and from this side, and it's a uniform size, I think. So you see, and it's overlay all the geometry. But again, if you have repeated pattern, it is okay. If you have unique texture, you have to unwrap it manually. So, well, again, I was planning to do something really short, and it's already over 20 minutes. Well, I hope it's enough for basics. If you have questions, you can ask on the comment section, and if I have time, I'll try to help you. Well, this is it for today. If you like it, like it. If you don't like it, you can always leave a mean comment on the comment section below. Till next time, bye bye.